My name is Jan Harzan. I'm the executive director for MUFON. We are a scientific research organization that basically collects sighting reports from the public and then goes and investigates them. Our mission statement as an organization is the scientific study of UFOs for the benefit of humanity, and we have three primary goals. We investigate UFO reports, we promote research into the UFO subject, and we educate the public on our findings.
Well, first what I'll do is I'll give you a little flight demo of Beamship Variation 1. I designed this way back in spring of '02, and it also won the Detroit Metro Science Fair. It won the Detroit Metro Science Fair grand prize in physics in spring of '03 for 3 Dearborn, Michigan high schoolers. Anyway, I'll just give you a little flight demo of the Variation 1. Now, that'll go up as high as you want. We keep it lightweight for safety, so we don't have to feed in a lethal amount of voltage, basically. That's floating on probably about 30,000 volts, anywhere from 25 to 30,000 volts at about 1 to 1.5 milliamps, something like that. Not a lot of wattage, less than 50 watts, something like that. It's high voltage, low amperage. But what happens is, this top wire that runs all the way around the device, is this coming through okay?
The sound is coming through, yeah.
Okay, yeah, the top wire is called the anode. That's charged normally positively. The foil skirt is what is basically the flying saucer. That is the cathode. And what happens, through Coulomb's law of electrostatic attraction, the cathode wants to fall into the anode. The higher the voltage, the more the force. And the greater the horizontal force, vertical force, whichever way it's oriented, it will go. And of course, oriented away from the Earth's surface, that's the direction which we call anti-gravity. But it's really not anti-gravity per se, as much as antimatter is the opposite of matter, opposite spin and charge of normal matter. It's developing an artificial gravity field in 180 degrees opposition to the Earth's gravity field. Now, what's powering it is this little power supply here. We call it Power Supply Alpha. We get them from Information Unlimited. They make it for us really cheaply. And that's this unit here. It's really no larger than a pack of cigarettes. I have it propped up against this insulator here, and it's running off a 12-volt Radio Shack power supply. I could later, if you want, show how it runs with a lithium-ion battery. I have a lithium-ion battery of the type that's normally used with electric radio-controlled cars, planes, and helicopters, that sort of thing. But anyway, in this state, it has no inertia. It has no g-forces. It can go from 0 to 2,000 miles an hour with no perturbation. If you were inside, you'd feel nothing. Every atom of ship and payload within this electrical field responds at the same rate to the applied voltage. And that's what's happening. There's no thrust coming from anywhere. Got to make sure not to touch the ground wire. You'll feel like a cool wind, but that wind is nowhere near strong enough to lift the device by about, the U.S. Army said, about 3 orders of magnitude. If any of you are scientists, you know how much an order of magnitude is. So this is just floating, and it'll go up as high as you want, as fast as you want. There are about 5 factors that determine the efficiency of the Biefeld-Brown effect. Number 1, by increasing the voltage, you increase the effect. And the effect is exponential with increasing voltage, so that's quite a bit. Number 2, increasing the area of the capacitor plates. If you increase the capacitor plate area, you get a much greater effect. And that's what I found in my data table, which I'll read off to you later in my paper from New Energy Technologies magazine, or actually journal. The dielectric, if you have a higher K-factor dielectric between the anode and the cathode plate, you'll have a much greater effect. Air is maybe hardly any dielectric effect at all. You could use barium titanate and get a much higher effect. I think I'll turn this off because transistor is getting pretty hot now, by about now. See, it is a heavier than aircraft. Another factor which increases the effect is increasing the mass of the dielectric, and there's your connection with gravity. You have more atoms doing the work, increasing the force even more. So basically, when I was young, I was interested in UFOs all my life. When I was a kid in the 60s, UFOs had only been a phenomenon since World War II, about 20 years in 1967 when I was in the first grade. But I was interested. I thought, how could they just fly with no propellant? How could they fly so fast? How could they fly without any noise? How could they hover and take off? It seemed like they were making fields of artificial gravity. But in the physics literature that I was aware of, there was no way of generating a gravity field. Well, little did I know, in 1982, I came across this work, which was, if any are familiar with the Billy Meyer case and Wendell Stevens, this is book UFO Contact from the Pleiades. It's published in 1980. There's a section on how they could travel here, how the Pleiadians or Pleiarans could travel here at such incredible velocity. Well, it's not really incredible velocity as much as it is a shift in space-time, but we can duplicate these power sources. I saw David Froning, H.D. Froning, works for McDonnell Douglas, or did work for McDonnell Douglas, he's retired now, at Kofi 3 in Washington, D.C., way back in October of '09. And in here, in this book, UFO Contact from the Pleiades, he details a paper with, any of you know Boolean algebra, how we can get to the Pleiades or any star system in reasonable time and economy. He talks about the investigation of a quantum ramjet for interstellar flights. And this is for the AIAA SAE ASME 17th Joint Propulsion Conference in July of '81. And he talks about with electric propulsion, field effect propulsion, we could be liberated from our own solar system and explore other planets, other stars, other galaxies, anywhere we want to go, any speed we want to go. There was also a paper by Alan C. Holt of the AIAA and NASA on how we can travel with starships, with lasers, laser-guided ships, to any planet. And this was his paper, Alan C. Holt's Prospects for a Breakthrough in Field-Dependent Propulsion, AIAA 80-1233, NASA Johnson Space Center, and that was June 30th, July 2nd in 1980 in Hartford, Connecticut, Joint Propulsion Conference. And he talks about a field-dependent propulsion system that is pretty much a clone of this, and using lasers where they can exceed light speed by many times over. And since this system has no moving parts, no inertial mass is canceled on this. You could go any speed and your inertial mass doesn't build up. What that means is, with no inertial mass buildup, the speed of light shouldn't be a barrier any more than the speed of sound was a barrier to Chuck Yeager in his Bell X-1. But anyway, I'll read a little bit from a paper I wrote last year for my talk at the Tesla conference. First, what I want to do is show you. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Can you hear Russell? Okay?
Can you hear me okay back there? What I want to do is show you some work that I did 11 years ago. Yeah. What I like to do is also go to YouTube.
Yeah, I think, oh, okay. Right.
Yeah, YouTube, and I'll show you a video of T.T. Brown saucers, Thomas Townsend Brown saucers, his patent number 2949550, granted in 1960, August 16th, 1960, that I started building. Jennifer had mentioned that I started building these 2-foot diameter saucers, T.T. Brown saucers, in 1990. We got those working in 1999 with a tower and rotor apparatus, just like the patent, nothing different. Then we built 3-foot diameter, 1-meter diameter saucers, and the results were much more impressive, and so was the force field. But anyway, I'll actually type in beam T.T. Brown.
Okay.
T.T. Brown electrokinetic.
T. Brown.
Electrokinetic. Electro. That's a, well, it could be elector.
Connect.
All one word. All one word.
Oh, okay. All one word.
All one word.
Okay. Delete.
Electro and K.
Electro.
Yeah, back up. Yeah, we'll K.
C-O-N or K-O-N?
K.
There's electro.
K. I-N.
I-N.
E. T. I. C. apparatus, space apparatus.
Yeah, space app.
Yeah, so this is back in Reno, Nevada at the second Antigravity conference that we were asked to attend. Me and my friend, my lab partner, basically Dave, there it is. So that's my doing back in 1999 that they asked us to present in June of 2000.
Do you
And
want the,
I don't know if you can hear the sound,
Oh,
yeah.
we can bring it up. I think. Is it, oh, let's see, yeah, it should be.
Yeah,
I don't
should
know
be.
why the sound is not coming
Yeah,
through here.
sound's not coming through, but that was in Reno, Nevada. Built those discs nicely, especially for the conference, but that's going with a homemade generator, basically from a kit from Information Unlimited, about anywhere from 100,000 to 120 kV, 120,000 volts, at some tens of microamps. So just a few microamps of current, just enough current to sustain the charge. So they're swinging around probably about 12 RPM, something like that. And they're really heavy. They're about maybe about 5 pounds each. And the rotor apparatus on top, that's not that heavy. But they get up and go from a standing start to about 12 RPMs in a few seconds when the high voltage is applied. So basically, again, just like the floating apparatus, the hovering VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing apparatus, we have an electrode in front, that's the copper tube, and the saucer is the foil skirt. The flying saucer is this part. So through Coulomb's law of electrostatic attraction, which Einstein's unified field theory for gravitation and electricity, or Einheit-Lichtenfeld theory, or Einheit-Lichtenfeld theory, was released with great fanfare to the New York Times in 1929. It was January 12th of 1929, where Einstein courageously bound up gravitation and electricity into a single expression, and at about that same time, or actually 2 years before, a young Thomas Townsend Brown was discovering high voltage artificial gravity. This is not anti-gravity, this is artificial gravity. What is happening is a G-well forms in front of the device on the copper tube, and a G-hill forms behind the device, behind the saucer. So what is formed is an electrogravitational wave, and the saucer is basically riding this wave of modified space-time like a surfboard riding a wave. And it will ride that wave of modified space-time into infinity as long as the charge is maintained. And the idea is to make these contraptions as round and smooth as possible, because high voltage electrical charges tend to want to adhere to round and smooth surfaces. For instance, you have the terminus of a Tesla coil or a Van de Graaff generator. You want it to be round. You want it to be smooth to contain the charge so you can get as high a voltage as possible. Here you want to contain the charge. The disc, the saucer apparatus acts like a capacitor. As long as you hold on to that charge and store as much charge as possible, you're going to get propulsion. You get silent electric propulsion. This is clean propulsion. There's no fuel. There's no moving parts. There's no pollution. No heat. No consumption of Earth's oxygen. This is true motion in the purest sense. And what is happening is a modification, a localized modification of space-time, as if a large mass was ahead of the disk.
That's what makes the whole thing.
That's what makes the whole thing go. Anyway, I'll read a little bit. Oh, and by the way, this is my company for the last 11 years, Applied Electrovitics, here in Pennsylvania. This is at Valley Forge Park, right down the hill where we fly a lot. www.appliedelectrovitics.com. There's the phone number. I'm local. I'm just like literally not even a mile away. 484-255-1072 in Devon. So anyway, this is a little abstract of a paper that I did for last year's presentation at the Nikola Tesla Inventors Club down in Philadelphia at the Ethical Society in Rittenhouse Square. And it talks about, I talk about the beam ship, which is that device, award-winning device, Detroit Metro Science Fair 2003 Grand Prize in Physics. The beam ship, the Biefeld-Brown effect, and the origin of gravitation or gravity and inertia. The abstract is the beam ship from Russell Anderson, that's me, and the motive forces, the Biefeld-Brown effect, are examined, and also the fundamental forces, agencies responsible for gravitation and inertia in general are examined with fundamental equations. The force is basically 100 million times more powerful than ion wind. And ion wind has an upper limit in the atmosphere and works in vacuum. In fact, it's more efficient in vacuum and is devoid of inertia and g-forces. So this can make instant starts, stops, changes in direction at any speed you want. And since there's a bow wave of high energy electrostatics ahead of the device, it softens the air, the effect of air coming in contact with the metal, and you have effectively negated sonic boom. Now, I have a little thing to read from Electrogravitic Systems by my colleague and friend Tom Vallone down at Antigravity Institute in Washington, D.C. And a little bit about the background here. The Biefeld-Brown electrogravitational effect was discovered by a then 17-year-old Thomas Townsend Brown in 1927 while experimenting with an early Crookes X-ray tube. The tube apparatus seemed to experience a thrust in one direction, and every time the high voltage was activated. Brown determined that the force was a unidirectional force, in other words, only in one direction, acted like a mass force, similar to gravitation. Later on, and associated with Dr. Paul Alfred Biefeld of Denison University, the force was dubbed the Biefeld-Brown effect, or the Biefeld-Brown effect, around 1929. Dr. Mason Rose, who wrote a paper on it, appeared in the 1929 issue of Science and Invention, the Hugo Gernsback publication, called The Flying Saucer. Brown wrote and published his own paper, How I Control Gravitation, in 1929. Brown seems to imply that the equation for his electrogravitic force might be F equals Vm1 Vm2 over R squared. So that is the force and the voltage times the mass of the cathode, or the cathode plate, and the mass of the anode plate divided by R squared, which is the radius or area of the device. And you can multiply out and change your factors to get the force you want, exactly the force you want in any direction. Now, the validation of the anomalous forces not predicted by theory are that the Biefeld-Brown effect comes from several sources, notably the U.S. Army, whose tests indicated that, quote, that ion wind is incorrect by at least 3 orders of magnitude compared to what is observed. So it's far more force for the input power. Oh, by the way, parenthetically, this is what I am in charge of, the inverse gravity vehicle, or UFO. That's a 64 strut apparatus, which is basically a flying saucer housing the Searle effect generator. Yeah, in fact, we should click on that. Don't want to run out of time.
Okay, pull right in here and click on that.
Actually, can we go back?
Sure.
Back page. I'm sorry. We'll talk about the inverse gravity vehicle in the middle in a minute. But that's what I'm in charge of, and setting up a spaceport for those. Can we go to Beamship Variation 3?
Is this a website we could click on?
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
You can go out if you're.
All you got to do is just type in Beamship Variation 3 or Beamship Captain.
I have scratch paper over here if you want to write any of this down. The yellow scratch paper on the end.
Now that's Beamship Variation 3. That's 6 feet on each side, 6 feet in diameter, and it weighs about 50 grams. That's lofting with about 47, 48 watts, something like that, from this commercial power supply on the floor. I don't know if you can see it, but I bring it as a backup just in case. This was the old technology. You can see I can hardly lift this thing as compared to, and that was powered basically by a flyback transformer, which is a modified Tesla coil. So Nikola Tesla helped make this.
How fast can it move? I got here late.
Any speed you want. There is no limit to the speed, theoretically.
How come nobody's ever heard of it? 1929 you mentioned.
Actually, a lot of people have heard of it. A We're just hearing about it.
Well, it just goes to show what we value in our society.
Yeah, but do you have some money interests that are hiding this, or trying to sit on you?
Every aerospace company and every military agency you can name has had their fingers in the electrogravitic pie
They're actually trying to use it?
since the 1940s.
This is probably what is well developed in maybe black ops. You know, this is where our black budget money is probably going.
If you've heard of the Philadelphia experiment, that was worked upon by Thomas Townsend Brown by his own admission, as well as Nikola Tesla and Albert Einstein, whose equations on the unified field theory from the Princeton Institute for Advanced Study was nearby. So they determined that they could definitely make things radar invisible. Didn't know that at that time that they could make things optically invisible too.
That's like the
But
Philadelphia experiment.
that's exactly right. And that happened about 25 miles away from here back in 1943. So
Did they give you a rough time at all telling people about it or not?
not so far, sir. It's pretty much now it's like trying to hold back a tidal wave with a teacup. But anyway, that's also my doing. That's a 4-foot beam ship variation 2. It's all the same technology that I started building way back in 1990, and I've been lecturing on it since 1990 also in Colorado Springs. But anyway, they talk about there's a ballistic transport of charges under high voltage DC bias. Ions are thought to be accelerated by the high potential difference between electrodes and the recoil force observed on an asymmetric capacitor, which this is. In other words, the area of this anode is a lot smaller than the area of this cathode. So this would be the emitter, this would be the collector in conventional thought. A simple upper limit on ion wind force shows that ion wind is a factor of at least 3 orders of magnitude too small. So anyway, I have a whole ream of calculations. I won't bore you with the calculations, but just say through the math and through the physical upper limit on ion wind, they determine that it's not ion wind that's propelling these devices. That's what the U.S. Navy thought and the Office of Naval Research thought back in 1952. By 1955, they had revised that opinion. And I have a few things to read. Here is an excellent book. Put this mic back. Excellent book also by Tom Vallone, his colleague, called Electrogravitic Systems. And this is validating reports on a new propulsion methodology, basically your electrogravitics. Now, this is a copy of a letter from Thomas Townsend Brown Foundation in Nassau, Bahamas, and dated February 14th, 1973, carrying the following information personally signed by T. Townsend Brown. Dear, I guess Tom Vallone, you have asked several questions which I shall try to answer. The experiments in vacuum were conducted at Société Nationale de Construction Aéronautique du Sud-Ouest in Paris, France, 1955-56. Vacuum test successful. Agnew H. Banson Laboratories, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, 1957-58. Successful vacuum bell jar tests. And at the GE Space Center, General Electric Space Center at King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, in 1959. So it's right around the corner, not even a mile away from here. Laboratory notes were made, but the notes were never published and are not available. The results were varied depending on the purpose of the experiment. Anyway, a little bit more about that. I will elaborate on the French experiments. Beyond rocket propulsion, this is an excellent book if anybody has seen this. This is Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion by Paul A. Laviolette, PhD. I saw Dr. Laviolette's lecture on subquantum kinetics. This is also one of his excellent books. Talks about Model G, gravitation is electrical, inertia is electrical. So that was way back in 1990. I did my first lecture at the same conference. Basically, he talks about ion wind force. The upper limit estimate for ion wind force may be arrived at through the following calculation. An electron current of 2 times 6 to the minus 10 amps would comprise an ion wind flux of epsilon equals 1.25 times 10 to the 13 electrons per second. A voltage drop of 250,000 volts would accelerate these particles to a velocity v equals 2.96 times 10, I'll try to talk a little slower for those of you who are writing, times 10 to the 10 centimeters per second, or 0.988 C, which would yield a Lorentz factor of y equals 6.6. I know I'm not saying the precise mathematical symbol of that, but you can look it up. The ion wind force or electron momentum flux would equal F equals 9.1 times 10 to the minus 28 grams of electrons. So that's quite a lot of electrons. Electrons have negative mass in a gravitational field, times y times epsilon times v times 2.2 times 10 to the minus 3 dynes. If the ion wind was made up only of aluminum ions instead of electrons, the resulting force would only be 38-fold greater. By comparison, the lifting force Brown observed amounted to 110 grams times 980 centimeters per second squared. That's an acceleration force of, that equals 1.08 times 10 to the 5 dynes. Now, what we have here in the saucer, I don't know if this will show up on the video, in the flying saucer that you just saw that I built, hanging, here it is hanging from a rope or something so it can move freely. You have an accumulation of positive ions or positive charges, space charge, in front of this flying saucer from the copper tube electrode or the anode wire. And you have a negative charge or chassis ground charge on the saucer itself or the cathode skirt. Now, the higher the voltage, the more is the attraction between the two. And since the attraction is unequal, it's always unequal, even if the capacitor plates are the same, you get a net force in one direction. You get an E hill in front of the device and a G well. Behind the device, you get a G hill and an E well. So you get a nice looking paraboloid shape there. But this is basically warp drive. The picture of this and the equations match totally the equations you use to break the sound barrier, only you're doing it with electronic forces. And since the forces cause the entire device, ship and payload, every single atom to move at the same rate, there's no freight cars effect as there is with normal, conventional internal combustion. No freight cars effect. So what you have is basically a falling into the electrode, into the forward electrode that it can never reach. So as long as the charge is maintained, the craft or saucer or this triangular device will continue to fall in the direction of the positive electrode. Now, in this chapter on Beyond Rocket Propulsion, and here is another picture of T.T. Brown's original apparatus. And this was when he was in Los Angeles at the New School for Social Research in the early to mid-50s, 1950s. Anyway, it talks about Brown's electrified flying disc. During the years following World War II, Brown continued to improve his gravitator device in his spare time, financing his effort through the Townsend Brown Foundation. By 1950, he had built a test apparatus, and here's what we built. By 1950, he built a test apparatus to demonstrate the electrogravitic propulsion concept in a pair of disc airfoils. He set the 6-foot-long horizontal beam on a pivot so it could rotate about its midpoint, as you saw on the YouTube broadcast. And from each end of the beam, he suspended 2 lightweight saucer discs by means of 7-foot-long tethers. When the saucers were in flight, rotating tethers extended sideways and expanded the diameter of the flight course to as much as 20 feet. In one version, each disc was made of 2 curved aluminum shells, as I built, measuring 1 foot in diameter, fixed on either side of a 1.5 diameter plexiglass sheet. High voltage power up to 50,000 volts was supplied through feed wires to positively charge a fine outboard wire running along each disc leading edge and to negatively charge the aluminum disc body. When electrified with approximately 50 watts of high tension, high voltage power, the disc traveled around their 20-foot diameter course silently at speeds of up to 12 miles per hour. Anyway, As to how the disk generates its propulsion force, two possibilities present themselves. One is that the ion clouds it emits produce electrostatic fields that act on charges attached to the disk's leading edge wire and to its main body, producing a net forward thrust. The other possibility is that an electrolytic thrust may be present whereby the positive and negative ion clouds would create, respectively, a gravity potential well and a gravity potential hill in their vicinity, as I stated. As new positive charges are continuously added to the cloud, they replace charges that leave the cloud through attraction to the disk's negative pole or negative body. As a result, the cloud will maintain a moderately deep gravity well at its bow through a kind of dynamic equilibrium. The same will hold for the disk's rearward negative charge. Despite the mobility of the individual negative ions, the negative ion cloud as a whole will persist and create a net gravity hill. So, consequently, the gravity potential gradient established across the disk body between this hill and the well propels the disk forward in the direction of the positive ion cloud. And here's a little excerpt from Dr. Mason Rose's paper. The saucers made by Brown have no propellers, no jets, no moving parts at all. They create a modification of the gravitational field around themselves, which is analogous to putting them on an incline of a hill. They act like a surfboard on a wave. The electrogravitational saucer creates its own hill, which is a local distortion of the gravitational field. Then it takes this hill with it in any chosen direction and at any rate. Then it says, in the chapter from Dr. LaViolette, a full-scale version of Brown's vehicle is thought to be able to accelerate to thousands of miles per hour, change direction, or stop merely by altering the intensity, polarity, and direction of its electric charge. Because of the wave-like distortion of the local gravitational field, it would pull with an equal force on all particles of matter. The ship, its occupants, and its load would all respond equally to these maneuvers. So you would feel nothing. The occupants would feel no stress at all, no matter how sharp the turn or how great the acceleration. What does that remind you of? It sure reminds me of UFOs, doesn't it? Whether it's the saucers or the triangular craft or the cigar-shaped craft or any of it. It's field effect propulsion. In field effect propulsion, there is no inertia. There are no G-forces. There is no sense of motion within. In fact, in Professor Searle's device, which I'll talk a little bit about, then I'll show you a little video, you don't feel anything. In fact, you're held fast to the deck by a 1/2 G gravitational field. So if you weigh 160 pounds, you only weigh 80 pounds inside the saucer, inside the flying saucer. And since you don't weigh anything, well, you weigh half of what you weigh on Earth. Since there's no inertia, inertial mass is canceled. The speed of light is no longer a barrier to this form, to propulsion. This form of propulsion, even something as simple as this, opens up the entire universe to Earth humans for the first time in Earth history.
We're coming to your house this weekend.
Well, I'll do a little cleanup first, but you're all welcome. But anyway, whereas jets and rockets attempt to combat the force of gravity through application of opposed brute force, electrogravitics instead attempts to directly control gravity. This is gravity control, so that its longtime adversary is made to work for the craft rather than against it. And excellent book, came out a couple years ago, Dr. LaViolette's book, Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion. Subtitle is Tesla, UFOs, and Classified Aerospace Technology. And I'll just read you the chapter. I highly recommend all of you sitting here reserve a copy of this book, go to Amazon.com. This is the chapters listing, and it's just blow your mind, open up a whole area of science and research to you. Chapter 1, Anti-Gravity, From Dream to Reality. Chapter 2, Beyond Rocket Propulsion. That's the chapter I read for you. 3, Onward and Upward, expansions on Brown's work. 4, an etheric explanation. Ether theory is validated. 5, the U.S. Anti-Gravity Squadron, and I will read from this in a minute. 6, gravity beam propulsion. 7, Project Skyvault. 8, microwave phase conjugation. 9, unconventional flying objects. 10, the Searle effect. Professor Searle is my boss. I am in charge of the inverse G vehicles. 11, and by the way, if any of you listen to George Noory tonight, Professor Searle is going to be on. So when you get home, go on coast to coast, and check out Professor Searle, my boss, talking about his work.
At our time, midnight?
At our time, midnight should be.
What frequency is that?
I forget. I have it set on AM radio in the other room, but
Dick is our expert.
The local stations don't even carry until like 2 o'clock.
yeah, so you might have to stay up real late, but it's worth it.
We got on the internet, go like KTRS.
Right, you can go on the internet and get it any.
You can get it back, like tomorrow, you could listen to it, correct?
Only if you pay as a subscriber.
Oh, you can subscribe.
Could we run the DVD?
Absolutely. Yep. We can switch. Right behind you is a button that pushes for DVD,
Okay.
oh, this one, let's stick.
Yeah. But anyway, that's a little bit about my work, and the Biefeld-Brown effect is published. Chapter 10 is the Searle effect, the entire chapter devoted to the Russian copy and published. They confirmed many of the aspects of the Searle effect: temperature drop, high voltage, magnetic walls, gravitational drop at very low RPMs. Chapter 11, electrogravitic wave experiments. Chapter 12, high voltage electrogravitics experiments. Chapter 13, a black hole discovered at NASA. So this technology goes in, but it won't come out. 14, a technology that could change the world. And that's what we're seeing in our more enlightened age. Thank God for the internet. And then appendices: A, letters written to T. Townsend Brown by Thomas Terman. B, Aviation Studies International Limited Publications. C, electrogravitic systems. D, brief description of experiments made in Paris by T. Townsend Brown. Those are the famous Paris experiments in high vacuum, where they discovered not only does it work in vacuum, it works much better in vacuum. You can turn the current down to nothing because there are no coronal losses. So you get the same and greater effects for less input power.
Would that be applicable to outer space, because outer space?
Of course.
Okay.
Of course. They once thought rockets wouldn't work in a vacuum either in the 1920s, when Robert Goddard was doing his experiments about the same time Thomas Townsend Brown was discovering this work. They said, how could rockets work in a vacuum? There's nothing to push against. Of course, we now...
Did they also discover just recently that if light in a vacuum moves faster than the speed of light?
Well, they discovered some interesting things where it's been proven that... let's see. Oh, there's a mainline MUFON. Now, I had some other papers that I was looking for. If you could run the video while I look for those other... Now, this is from about 8 years ago, 2002, that I created this video. This comes with all of my Beamship kits, which are on sale on my website.
The 3-foot beam ship variation 1 from Applied Electrogravitics.
That's down at Valley Forge Park, right down the hill, in 02. Same as that. It's the exact same model. Same model. Yeah, otherwise it would head for the power supply at high voltage, dangerous matter at high speed. Don't get too close. You got a weak heart, don't get too close. What time is it about? What's the time?
If the time is now 7:30, so we have a whole hour and 10 minutes.
Great. And you notice, with internal combustion, all the hundreds of moving parts. With internal combustion, you notice all the hundreds of moving parts, and the noise, and the fuel, and the pollution, and the exhaust. It's a cacophony.
Yeah.
Now, which would you prefer? That's floating over the table, it's almost making no noise. When the power's turned down, it makes almost no sound at all. Would you prefer that to get around from place to place and vertical takeoff and landing? Or would you prefer this? to get around from place to place in vertical takeoff and landing. With vertical takeoff and landing, you don't need runways. You don't need airports.
The petrochemical industry likes the other one better.
Oh, of course they do. Big business, big special interests. They got deep pockets. Yeah.
What would happen if you didn't have it on a string? Would you not be able to necessarily
It
control
wouldn't be controlled.
It would just...
It would just go whichever way it wants to go, out of control.
And you
Well,
would
that's what I'm
chasing
working on.
around
The
woods.
radio control version is coming for the 5 and 6 footer, Beamship Variation 5 and Beamship Variation 3. That's Beamship Ultra. That'll be all radio controlled with the latest lightweight power supply. And
Variation 1 from Applied Electric Davidics. Flying down at Valley Forge, flying to at Valley Forge Park, Pennsylvania.
How much voltage is that?
Sunday.
probably about 60 watts, 40,000 volts at 1.5 milliamps. Full power from that supply on the floor. I was using this power supply with an inverter hooked up to the car. A little less, probably comparable, maybe about 30,000 volts at 1.5 milliamps, something like that. No, you don't want to touch it. It'll be jump up to the ceiling in anti-gravitational fashion. Now, what I want to do is, no, actually go forward a little bit. The remote control. Let's see, can I operate it?
Yeah, please. do.
Yeah, can I
It's
skip
right
ahead?
there.
Okay. I'm going to skip ahead to the interesting parts. This is the construction tutorial that comes free with each Beamship kit. Shows you how to build it with the parts that come with the kit. There's the payload tray. And let's see. I'll go back. If I can.
Turn the volume up.
Let's see, I'll go forward a little bit. I'm hooking up the cathode wire to the cathode plate. I'm in my bare feet because it's ungodly hot. But it's my apartment right down the hill in Devon. And I'm getting ready to flight demo the newly built Beamship kit. Oops, didn't mean to go back that fast. Go even faster. The cathode wire going up to the foil skirt. The foil skirt is the cathode or chassis ground. The anode wire is on top. Now I'm hooking it up. That's the anode wire. That's going to the wire on the top, or the emitter. And I'm hooking it up to the old-fashioned power supply. Now, I want to play.
At 34,000 volts. Okay, everything's secure. We're ready to lift your Beamship Variation 1 off the ground. Throttling on power now. Okay, that's a rock steady hover. But we're at the limit of the supply. Basically, we're at 1.5 milliamps. At 39,000 volts, I'm going to reduce power. That sound you hear is called corona noise and ion wind noise. That vibration is caused by an ion downdraft. I'm going to reduce power somewhat.
When I turn down the power, it goes totally silent because the ion downdraft is negated and it's just floating on its own. Basically a suspensor field.
Okay.
If you ever read the Dune novels.
It's a pretty stable hover. At 0.85 milliamps at 34,000 volts.
So not a lot of wattage, probably about 40 watts, 30 watts.
Radio control, you'll be in a hover and controlling it like a normal helicopter. Okay, raise power back up again. Steady hover. You really can hover at almost any altitude or any altitude. Just make sure when it starts to get out of control, raise power back up. I'm going to land it now just to show you what the landing configuration is now. or landing the heavier models, or landing any of the models from a high altitude, you definitely want some type of variable pulse control or variable voltage control. Okay, that was a pretty good landing. I'm going to take it off one more time.
It kind of screws up there, but it's shorted out. If it shorts out, if the wires short out, the field collapses and the model drops like a stone. Basically.
Also available from Applied Electrogravitics, a 4-foot beam ship variation 2. Lift off.
So there it is floating on its suspensor field. This is your future, folks. This is the future that has been denied to us for 70 years. But through my efforts and efforts of many people around the world, we can have aircraft and spacecraft that can go at any velocity with no sense of motion from within, no fuel. In fact, they actually clean the air as they fly. Exactly. It's a negative ion emitter and generator. They clean the air of radioactivity and pollution,
Again,
smog.
beam shift variation 2 from Applied Electrogravitics. In flight.
So this is technology with wire, tape, and rubber bands, basically. But of course, you can scale it up just like anything else in aerospace. And off you go to Mars in about 5 days instead of 5 months. Non-ballistic motion. You don't have to cover or do curving ballistic trajectories. You just go straight line of sight where you want to go. This is non-ballistic motion. That's the 4-footer, beam ship variation 2. It's actually more efficient. The larger you build them, the more efficient they are. Yeah, many of you recognize John Williams, fantastic music for Lost in Space. Of course, now he's Oscar winner for every successful movie out there. Of course, over the last 30 years or 33 years, all the successful movies have been science fiction movies. I wonder why that is.
Automobiles just make them
Yes,
lighter weight.
yes. It can be used to propel the automobiles even. Ocean liners, submarines, anything that moves can use this technology for propulsion. Silent, pollution-free propulsion that has been denied to you and me by the military.
It'll work underwater?
Also,
No reason why it shouldn't work underwater. It works under oil,
beam ship variation 3.
maybe seawater,
Under 2 meters.
but there's ways around that.
Beam ship.
That's the 6-footer beam ship variation 3. 6 feet in diameter. Second largest such device in the world since 2002. No one's made any bigger except the Japanese, and they have a 5-meter version. This is 2 meters.
That's flying about 60
Through research, many different shapes I tried, we found the most efficient shape for a field-propelled condenser was either a saucer or a triangle. And that's what we see in actual life.
Equilateral?
Yes. It's a field-propelled condenser, so the force is equal on all 3 sides. Like a 3-legged stool. All you need is just 3 legs to hold it up.
If you had it not equilateral, would it move in that direction?
It would then the field would be asymmetrical, and you wouldn't get a nice steady hover.
Now, this power supply can modulate the high voltage
It sure would.
current, control the flight.
Different ways. Same way they do for electric cars. basically the force, the electrostatic force on an enclosed conductor stays on the outside. So just like inside your car, the safest place during a thunderstorm, the charges always stay on the outside of an enclosed conductor. But you always want to stay insulated for obvious reasons. So here I'm just modifying the power a little bit just by varying the voltage or the current level on the variable power supply, old-fashioned power supply that's on the floor there. That's only 60 watts.
It's 40,000 volts at 1.5 milliamps of current.
60 watts.
The electronic inputs would vary according to the load then.
Yes. Yes, that's exactly right. The anode wire, actually the cathode wire contacted the anode, and you can see it sparking along there. If that happens, it shorts out and the field collapses, the model drops like a stone, because it is heavier than air. It's shorting out a little bit, so it can't quite get enough lift. Now, all the power goes into propulsion. Get a nice lift off, nice steady hover. I never get tired of watching them. When you're tugging on the tethers, it feels like you're tugging on a hot air balloon. The force is so much. It's obvious it's not an weak ion thrust. It's a very powerful thrust.
You can smell a little ozone too, I guess.
Oh, sure, yeah. You generate ozone. That's how you generate ozone.
Electrogravitic technology from Applied Electrogravitics available right now
Can you negate
in
chemtrails?
the year
Burn them up?
2002,
Oh my God.
2002.
Cloud around it, could that create like a mist around it so you couldn't see it?
Under certain atmospheric conditions, I would think so, yeah.
That's why some UFOs have maybe a cloud around them.
Condensation, yeah.
Yes.
I've flown these in fog machines to see if there's any downward thrust. I've done experiments with lasers. And the force seems to be an anomalous, very powerful anomalous force. That's the B-Field-Brown effect.
Is Brown still alive?
No, Brown died in 1985 or 86, I believe. I think 85.
Die naturally? They didn't bump
Died naturally, wasn't in the best of health.
Following immediately is a brief history of electrogravitics.
The thrust doesn't come from any one point on the device. It's a field effect. It's creating an artificial gravitational wave.
This is Russ Anderson from Applied Electrogravitics, Pennsylvania, USA.
Now, I don't know if you can see these pictures. Thank you, Jennifer.
You're welcome.
I don't know if you can see these pictures, but these are from an outdoor party in Malvern about, there's the beam ship. And pause it for this. Yeah, pause this if you could. Now, this was George S. Pigott, this guy here. George S. Pigott in 1903-04 was one of the first, along with Nikola Tesla and John Worrell Keeley, who was based in Philadelphia also, to do artificial gravity propulsion experiments in 1903 and 04. He has a curved cathode plate, conductive plate on the ground. This is a stand. This is a charged sphere, which is propagating a high voltage field. And in the background is a Wimshurst machine, which is in glass and under several atmospheres of pressure to raise the current level. And voltage is typically around 500,000 volts, about 500,000 volts. But almost no currents, maybe, some tens of microamps, but they just want enough current to maintain the charge. This was a small metal sphere, and around the sphere there could be patterns of blue dots, which would move all around the sphere, along with an anomalous dark band. And when we run the video, you'll hear me talk about that. But he was levitating anything from silver balls to corks to pieces of wood to pretty much almost anything. And he was doing this force field propulsion research before anybody had ever heard about field effect or UFOs or artificial gravity. And the UFO era wouldn't really start for another 40 years in World War II with the Foo Fighters cited by the Axis and the Allied parties. If you remember 1942, the Battle of Los Angeles, a very famous UFO encounter over a major city, first of many UFO encounters over major cities. So George S. Pigott was doing this work. Oh, if you could run the video. Was doing this work back at the turn of the century, 100 years ago, over 100 years ago.
7 feet in the air, using electrostatic field from a specially designed boom-source machine in a glass container under several atmospheres of pressure to raise the current level. Output voltage is typically 500,000 volts, that's half a million volts. The field was propagated by a charged sphere. A small curved conducting plate on the floor, as pictured, acted as the ground. With its true force field propulsion. He observed unusual patterns of blue dots with filaments over the suspended objects, sometimes with an anomalous 1/2 centimeter dark band on the suspended objects. Pigott states, "It is my firm conviction that somewhere on the outer confines of our planet there exists a similar contracting belt through which naught but the gravitational vibrations of the sun penetrate, and these vibrations absolutely annihilate or absorb all other less powerful ones." If the force was Coulombic in nature, that is, Coulomb's charges, Coulomb's came up with the theory of electrostatic charge attraction and repulsion. If it was Coulombic in nature, objects would at first be attracted and then strongly repelled by the charged metal sphere. In other words, the sphere would be producing a force field. After the objects were suspended, Pigott found he could remove the conducting ground plate, and the objects still floated, suspended. The phenomenon of levitation was accompanied by luminous halos. In 1925-27, Albert Einstein released his scientific gem, his Einheit-Lichten-Feld theory, or the unified field theory for gravitation and electricity, to the press and the scientific community. It combines electricity, magnetism, and gravitation into a single mathematical expression, showing how high voltage, low current electricity, that's electromagnetic, and conversely, low voltage, high current, magnetic gravity, acceleration fields, G fields, could be produced using then available relatively low technology. Indeed, very simple technology.
It is a simple technology.
It is the electrical field because it can produce gravitation and repulsion fields as well as magnetism. His crowning work was released with much press write-up and fanfare, then was quickly forgotten, as if the scientific community and the entire world had suffered some kind of collective amnesia. Stand by.
Anyway, I guess the video. Yeah, pause, yeah. So you can see that this work has had precedent going way back over 100 years, and yet that fact is curiously absent from our textbooks. Why in heaven's name? Now I'd like to read you a little bit of something, an article I came across on the internet, looking for propulsion systems. Talks about the PLT. It's a propulsion system that probably would take us faster than light. You know about the beam ships, Billy Meyer beam ship technology. They call it a beam ship because basically, if you know the story, most Earth humans came from ancient Lyra about 22 million years ago, and the first drive that enabled them to move between the stars, in other words, for interstellar travel, was a light-emitting drive, a tachyon drive, a light-emitting drive, and that created a spectacular beam. Later on, they switched to this type of electromagnetic drive, but they still kept the same name and needed that shape to propagate the field. As you can see, shape is everything. Anyway, the PLT has immense potential for the aerospace industry. For example, PLT-powered spacecraft could transit the 100 million kilometer to Mars in less than a week. And that's what you see also talks about with this T.T. Brown technology. Less than a week to get to Mars instead of 6 months. PLT, I think they talk about it here. Oh, photonic laser thruster. That's called, The PLT-powered spacecraft could transit the 100 million kilometers less than a week, says the inventor of the space drive, Dr. Young K. Bai, so, obviously Korean, in a press release. The efficiency of the photonic laser thruster seems to credit ingenious design more so than any technological breakthroughs. It was built using off-the-shelf parts, utilizes some common principles of science. In a nutshell, rough nutshell, the PLT uses a photonic laser and a sophisticated photon beam amplification system, quote unquote, in conjunction with precisely positioned mirrors to make a sort of light chamber, quote unquote, where photonic energy can be properly harnessed and focused for propulsion. This is your beam ship. Not only is the thruster capable of relatively quick acceleration, but similar to ion drives, the PLT requires no propellants. It's a fuelless drive, propellantless propulsion, nor requires any extreme amount of power. Thus, it is well suited for extended journeys into space, which you can't do with internal combustion. Cannot travel into deep space, especially manned space, with internal combustion. It will not work very well. A successful prototype of the PLT photonic laser thruster was demonstrated last year for many scientists. The prototype is much smaller than the engine that could be used on a spacecraft. Much smaller. Smaller. It's a very small device. But the fundamentals would be the same. So it's just a matter of scalability. Same thing here. Scale it up. You can scale anything up in aerospace. The fundamentals will be the same. The prototype had an egg-sized laser, it's not an egg-shaped laser, an egg-sized laser, and generated an amplification factor of 3,000. That's huge. That is huge. The PLT thruster was made by the BIE Institute and was funded by NASA. It talks about the black hole at NASA in this book. They're still sticking it to us with antiquated 1950s technology and early 1960s technology. Why? Dr. BIE is the founder of the BIE Institute and is by many accounts an all-around very intelligent guy. He has a PhD in experimental atomic and nuclear physics from the University of California, Berkeley. With the help of lab buddies, Dr. Bai discovered He2, helium-2, the negative helium molecular ion, and has been studying stuff like particle beams, antimatter propulsion physics, high energy density materials, and nanoparticles for somewhere around 20 years or so. So obviously someone you want to have on your spacecraft. Now, I'll read a little bit from electrogravitic systems, and then, since we have a time limit, I'm going to start talking about my specialty, also Searle technology. My boss is Professor John R.R. Searle, and he appointed me the head of his manned space division and manned space studies so that I could make the craft, the saucer craft, like this for all of you.
You said this was photographed in Melbourne?
This one was photographed in 1975 or 76 in Swiss airspace. This is that's the Billy Meyer beam ship. And anyway, there's a few excerpts from the book that these articles is in. Stranger than fiction, this book is spellbinding, an analogy of two unearthed reports on the secret work of T. Townsend Brown shortly after World War II. The first report, Electrogravitic Systems, is marked classified up until recently. So this work has been very carefully kept under wraps. I had an aunt who worked at Wright-Patterson during the 1950s also, over in Ohio, over in Dayton. Did the work Brown started building a saucer-shaped craft capable of electrical propulsion continue until this day? I say yes. The second report, The Gravitic Situation, is a fascinating update on the multinational research project, including a summary of Brown's high voltage specifications. And then why does Brown say the efficiency of his motor is 1,000,000 to 1? We'll talk about that too. Included is Dr. Paul LaViolette's, and I saw Dr. LaViolette lecture in Colorado Springs, the Tesla Symposium 1990, where I did my first lecture on electrogravitics. A research paper on the B-2 bomber, the B-2 Spirit bomber, makes you wonder why they call it Spirit, as a modern-day version of an electrogravitic aircraft, the U.S. Antigravity Squadron. And Dr. Elizabeth Rauscher, who I met 15 years ago, actually 16 years ago, almost exactly 16 years ago, at the Townsend Brown Conference here in Philadelphia, which I attended, says, Dr. Elizabeth Rauscher says, re-examine T.T. Brown. Anyway, I'll read a little bit of a few excerpts from it. Electrolytic anti-gravity technology, this is by Paul A. Laviolette, under development in the U.S. Air Force Black R&D program since late 1954, may now have been put to practical use in the B-2 Advanced Technology Bomber to provide an exotic auxiliary mode of propulsion. This inference is based on the recent disclosure that the B-2 charges both its wing leading edge and its exhaust stream, its jet exhaust stream, to a high voltage, high potential, opposite polarities. Positive ions emitted from its wing leading edge would produce a positively charged parabolic ion sheath ahead of the craft, while negative ions injected into its exhaust system, this would be the same with the saucer, the same ones I built, into the exhaust stream would set up a trailing negative space charge with potential difference in excess of 15 million volts. According to electrolytic research carried out by physicist T. Townsend Brown, such a differential space charge would set up an artificial gravity field, an artificial gravity field that would induce a reactionless force on the aircraft in the direction of the positive pole. An electrolytic drive of this sort could allow the B-2 to function with over-unity propulsion efficiency when cruising at supersonic velocities. For many years, rumors circulated that the U.S. was secretly developing a highly advanced radar-evading aircraft. And that rumor turned to reality in November of 1988, when the Air Force unveiled the B-2 Advanced Technology Bomber. Although a military spokesman, I removed the clip so I can read you the rest of that excerpt. Although a military spokesman provided the news media with some information about the craft's outward design and low radar infrared profile, here's our country's electrolytic craft in the public domain. There are many more that are not public that you would think came from another planet if you saw it flying around, let's say, Bucks County, PA, or Chester County, PA. And I have indeed witnessed UFOs in Westchester County, New York in the 1980s, where I used to live. Some key aspects, some key secrets about the B-2 were leaked to the press, however. March 9th, 1992, Aviation Week in Space Technology made the surprising disclosure that the B-2 electrostatically charges its exhaust stream and the leading edges of its wing-like body. Those familiar with the electrolytics research of American physicist T. Townsend Brown will quickly realize that this is tantamount to stating that the B-2 is able to function as an anti-gravity aircraft. Aviation Week obtained their information about the B-2 from a small group of renegade West Coast scientists, how about that? And engineers who were formerly associated with black research projects. Black research projects. Where have we heard that before? And making these disclosures, the scientists broke a code of silence that rivals the mafias. Rivals the mafia. In other words, they're more scared of our government than the mafia. How about that? They took the risk because they felt that it was important for economic reasons. Economic reasons. What do we have today? A bad economy that's recovering. That efforts be made to declassify certain black technologies for commercial use. Two of these individuals said that their civil rights had been blatantly abused in the name of national security. So civil rights, where have we heard before people's, citizens' civil rights being blatantly abused in the name of national security? Where have we heard that before? A whole bunch of places. Two of the individuals, anyway, they said they were ordered to either keep them quiet or to prevent them from leaving the tightly controlled black R&D community. Several months after the Aviation Week in Space Technology article, the black world security personnel went into high gear. That sector of the black R&D community received very strong warnings, and as a result, the group of scientists subsequently broke off the contact with the magazine. Anyway, it talks about what we talked about earlier. There's a G well in front of the craft, the saucer craft, and a G hill behind it, simply created by the high energy electrostatics. You don't need a lot of current, just enough current to maintain the charge. What gets it going is the high voltage. And Coulomb's law of electrostatic attraction, which in this configuration craft forms an artificial G well and G hill, which it rides that wave into infinity as long as the charge is maintained. Now, so I read about the G well and G hill earlier. Skeptics at first thought the disks were propelled by more mundane effects, such as the pressure of negative ions striking the positive electrode. It's a lot more force than that. Brown later carried out, as you've seen, Brown later carried out vacuum chamber tests, which proved that the force was present, even in the absence of such ion thrust. He did not offer a theory to explain this non-conventional electrogravitic propulsion. Well, we've seen the theory with, and I highly suggest everyone here, Google Einstein's unified field theory when you get home or later on tonight. He proved that they work more efficiently in the vacuum, except to say that it was predicted neither by general relativity nor by modern theories of electromagnetism. In fact, what this does, and the saucers do, they violate Newton's third law of motion, and they violate the first law of electrodynamics. There's more momentum created than is input in power. Not only, according to the novel physics of subquantum kinetics, and that's Dr. Laviolette's specialty, subquantum kinetics, gravity potential can adopt two polarities instead of one. Not only can a gravity field exist in the form of a matter-attracting potential, gravity potential well, as standard physics teaches, but it can also exist in the form of a matter-repelling gravity potential hill. It can also exist in the form of, moreover, it predicts that these gravity polarities should be directly matched with electrical polarity, positively charged particles such as protons generating gravity wells, and negatively charged particles such as electrons generating gravity hills. Consequently, subquantum kinetics, and highly recommend everybody also get a copy of Subquantum Kinetics, Systems Approach to Physics and Cosmology. Look at Model G. Model G. Subquantum kinetics predicts that the negative ion cloud behind Brown's disk should form a matter-repelling gravity hill, while the positive ion cloud ahead of the disk should form a matter-attracting gravity well. As increasing voltage is applied to the disk, the gravity potential hill and well become increasingly prominent, and the gravity potential gradient between them becomes increasingly steep. In Rose's terminology, Dr. Mason Rose, who wrote the book The Flying Saucer in Science and Invention in 1929 on Brown's work, in Rose's technology, the craft would find itself on the incline of a gravitational hill. Since gravity force is known to increase in accordance with the steepness of such a gravity potential slope, increased voltage would induce an increasingly strong gravity force on the disk and would act in the direction of the positive ion cloud. The disk would behave as if it was being tugged by a very strong gravitational field emanating from an invisible planet-sized mass positioned beyond its positive pole. And early in 1952, Brown had put together a proposal codenamed Project Winter Haven, which suggested that the military develop an anti-gravity combat saucer with Mach 3 capability, which is basically scaled-up versions of the saucer, the T.T. Brown saucers that I built. The 1956 intelligence study entitled Electrogravitic Systems, an Examination of Electrostatic Motion, Dynamic Counterbarrier and Barycentric Control, prepared by the private aviation intelligence firm Aviation Studies International, a subsidiary of the RAND Corporation, indicates that as early as November 1954, the Air Force had begun plans to fund research that would accomplish Project Winter Haven objectives. One indication that Brown's electrogravitics ideas were being researched by the aerospace industry surfaced in January 1968 at an aerospace's sciences meeting held in New York City. Northrop officials reported that they were beginning wind tunnel studies to research the aerodynamic effects of applying high voltage charges to the leading edge of aircraft bodies. So this is 42 years ago. They said that they expected that the resulting electrical potential would ionize air molecules upwind of the aircraft, and that the resulting repulsive electrical forces would condition the airstream so as to lower drag, reduce heating, and soften the supersonic boom. Northrop apparently got the idea for investigating this effect directly from Brown for his electrokinetic flying disc patent, that's patent number 2949550, August 16, 1960, explains that the positively charged leading edge electrode would produce just this effect. By using such a nose form, you could also do the same thing with aerospikes or nose cones for missiles or independently targeted reentry vehicles. By using such a nose form, which at present appears to be the best suited for flying speeds approaching or exceeding the speed of sound, I'm able to produce an ionization of the atmosphere in the immediate region of this foremost portion of the mobile vehicle. I believe that this ionization facilitates piercing the sonic barrier and minimizes the abruptness with which the transition takes place in passing from subsonic velocities to supersonic velocities. Also, in the 1952 paper on brown saucers, Dr. Rose stated, the Townsend-Brown experiments indicate that the positive field which is traveling in front of the saucer acts as a buffer wing, which starts moving the air out of the way. This field acts as an entering wedge, which softens the supersonic barrier. And interestingly, in 1981, the Pentagon contracted the Northrop Corporation to work on the highly classified B-2 advanced technology bomber. No surprise there. Any aircraft or aerospace industry or military agency would be derelict if they did not exploit this technology, and they weren't derelict. Anyway, although the Black World scientists mentioned nothing about electrovitics in the Aviation Week disclosure about the B-2, they did admit to the existence of, quote, very dramatic classified technologies, unquote, able to aircraft control and propulsion. They were especially hesitant to discuss these projects, noting that they are, quote unquote, very black. So that should tell you something why we haven't seen this. One of them commented, besides, it would take about 20 hours to explain the principles, and very few people would understand them anyway. Apparently what he's meant that is the aircraft control and propulsion technology is based on physics principles that go beyond what is currently known and understood by most academic physics. Indeed, by all normal standards, electrovitics is a very exotic propulsion science. It doesn't look very exotic to me. It looks very simple. The B-2's body design raises suspicions that the aircraft is indeed an electrovitic vehicle. A primary design criterion for an electrovitic craft is that it have a large, horizontally disposed surface area so as to permit the development of sufficiently strong anti-gravity lift force. So we see that the saucer is in fact the ideal shape to propagate the fields. As Townsend-Brown's experiments demonstrated, such an aircraft need not necessarily be disc-shaped. Triangular and square forms also exhibit anti-gravity lift, although the disc shape gives the best performance. The triangular planforms used in the B-2 and other advanced stealth aircraft may have been deemed better for reasons of their much lower radar cross-sections. And there's a whole bunch of, I highly recommend everybody look at this online and look it up, the U.S. Anti-Gravity Squadron. Let's see. The B-2's GE engines did General Electric, and of course Lockheed Martin right over there in King of Prussia used to be GE Space Center. The B-2's GE engines are reported to each be capable of putting out 19,000 pounds of thrust. Consequently, all four engines together should provide the B-2 with a total output of 140,000 horsepower, which translates into electric power output of about 25 megawatts, assuming a 30% conversion efficiency. By comparison, the November 1954 aviation report concluded that a 35-foot diameter electrogravitic combat disc, an electrogravitic combat disc, would need to have access to about 50 megawatts of power in order to attain Mach 3 flight speeds. So it appears that the magnitude of the B-2's power output is in the right ballpark. Anyway, I'll read you some of the, I'll get to the Searle stuff in a minute. I just want to go over a couple of the other things. Once the B-2 got going fast enough, it would receive a sufficient airflow through its scoops that it could maintain a relatively high flow rate of ionized exhaust, even with its engine combustion thrust substantially reduced. Since hot exhaust is not essential to its operation, the high voltage generator could just as well run on cool intake air, with the flame jets entirely shut off. And that would probably net about 10 to 15 million volts. As Brown points out in his electrokinetic generator patent, flame jet generator patent, it is to be understood that any other fluid stream source might be substituted for the combustion chamber and fuel supply. In such a coasting mode where jet combustion is entirely shut off, the B-2 would be able to fly for an indefinitely long period of time with essentially zero fuel consumption, powering itself primarily with energy tapped from its self-generated gravitational gradient. For example, during coasting, the kinetic energy of the scooped airstream would arise entirely from the craft's own forward motion. This motion, in turn, being due to the pull of the electrogravitic propulsion field, The kinetic energy of this ionized airstream responsible for linearly accelerating negative ions down the B2's exhaust ducts and hence for creating the multi-megavolt potential relative to the positive charge engine body. The craft's high voltage electron collector grids recover a portion of this power to run the craft's ionizers. Provided that this power drain is not excessive and that the plane's propulsive gravity field can be adequately maintained, the craft would be able to achieve a state of perpetual propulsion. Now you begin to see why the B-2 and similar aircraft in the public domain, at least, are still classified to this day. When the B-2 was first unveiled, critics had suggested that it could not risk flying at high altitudes because it might create vapor trails that might be visible to an enemy. Edward Aldridge, Jr., the Secretary of the Air Force, was asked whether that propulsion had been solved. He replied, yes, but we're not going to disclose it now. No big surprise there. Clearly, to explain how the B-2 could travel at such high altitude with its engines essentially shut off and producing no vapor trail, he would have to disclose the vehicle's non-conventional mode of propulsion. Anyway, some of the bibliography. La Violette, Electrogravitics, Back to the Future, Electric Spacecraft Journal, Issue 4, 1992. Aviation Studies International Limited, The Gravitics Situation, prepared by Gravity RAND, Division of Aviation Studies, that's the RAND Corporation, big think tank. Northrop, Studying Sonic Boom Remedy, Aviation Week in Space Technology, January 22nd, 1968. And T.T. Brown, Electrokinetic Generator, U.S. Patent 3022430, filed July 1957, issued February 1962. Rhodes L., ex-NASA expert, says stealth uses parts from UFO, Arkansas Democrat, Little Rock, Arkansas, April 9th, 1990, and some other patents. Now, I would like to switch gears and talk about another technology that's near and dear to my heart that that's already been tested in the form of 41 flying craft, most of them radio controlled, from Professor John R.R. Searle. And this is Professor Searle. This book, Antigravity, The Dream Made Reality, the story of John R.R. Searle. That was before he was Professor Searle. Came out in 1993. I got it as soon as it came out. This is a nicer paperback version. Pretty much get it everywhere. There's still a lot of copies left. I think it's going to be republished. This device is the Searle effect generator. 3 laminated stationary rings, 12 roller sets or runner sets on the inner ring. This is a magnetic prime mover. This is a generator and linear motor all in one unit. When more load is placed on it, when it's fitted with coils, it gets colder and runs faster. Too much load is placed on it, it's overloaded, it develops a field around itself, is cryogenic, the neodymium cores start superconducting, and the Earth repels it with great force. That kept happening, and they said, this is ridiculous. If it wants to fly, let's give it a body. So this is the body. This flying craft is called the P-11. It's 10 foot in diameter, and it's the same diameter of the craft that I'm building right now, which is the P-11. And I will put on some Searle tech for you. That's John Thomas, John A. Thomas, who was speaking earlier on Searle. And that's the guy in the back. I met him at the Conference on Future Energy in Washington, D.C. That was 3 years ago. Since then, I've been to Kofi 3. So John Thomas has taken over chores as the American helpmate. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, William T. Sherwood was the original guy. That was Professor Searle's American helpmate. And the footage you're about to see is from 1971, 72 in Berkshire Wood in England. Turn it up. That's Starport Earth 1 in Berkshire, where they're building the disk and where they sent off many P-11 craft, usually around Warminster, England. Warminster developed a reputation as a UFO hotspot. Obviously, it's a German program.
In einem Waldstück, das noch Überreste früherer technischer Zeitalter ziehen,
That structure, the Demo 1 craft, is 7 meters in diameter, 21 feet in diameter. It's made of the softest materials possible.
What's in the back?
Yeah. 64 struts, 64 flight cells. Starship Ezekiel. Ezekiel class model. That's painted wood. They deliberately used the softest material available to silence detractors who said it wouldn't hold together. Fact is, you could make it out of cardboard. The field holds it together. There are no stresses on the device when it's powered up. And see, instead of an expensive, dangerous fuel-burning concept, actually this was developed by Werner von Braun. They weren't dangerous. But you can see it uses fuel and burns fuel and is very noisy. This device is silent, no sound whatsoever, no fuel, no vibration, cold instead of heat. It runs very, very cold. It runs cryogenic. No vibration, no launch pads, no launch windows. It's fixing the flight cell sections that control the SEG, the generator. A lot of these people are still around, so if anybody tries to tell you this technology never existed, you can tell them where to go.
How big was it?
It's 21 feet, 7 meters.
In the Bible, it tells you that the will within the will, which is generated here, gives not only part, but wenn der Premierminister nicht bis zum 2. August.
It's reading from the Bible, the book of Ezekiel, the wheel within the wheel.
It's an idea that has led to the Berlin motor, a device which could form the basis of a transport system in the future.
This diamatic levitation is partly how the generator works, where the runners fly over the plates with no physical contact. It's a frictionless device, very cold running.
Don't the Japanese have trains like this?
Yes, that's maglev, yes. But instead of energizing the track, they energize the vehicle and run the vehicle over an aluminum track.
Oh, okay.
Much more efficient.
We can do the same thing with this aluminium ring.
It's called diamagnetic repulsion.
We can even make the ring jump in the air. It's an effect that seems to be produced by pushing a particular kind of current through coils of wire. By arranging the number of coils in a line, we can make a piece of aluminium float and travel over them.
Sorry for the poor quality of the video. It's like a 3rd or 4th generation. Looks nicer on DVD though.
Explaining how this happens. It turns out that the flow of electricity through the coil is produced by a wave-like effect, which will carry things along with it.
Anybody remember the Archimedes water screw? This is very Archimedean. See, it will carry the runners along because the combination of fields between plates and runners produces a wave-like effect. Now, let's see if I can jump ahead.
Yeah. So fast forward.
Yeah, do you have the remote here?
How fast forward is?
Yeah. Actually, I'll skip shuttle. Now, I'll shuttle ahead to some more radio interviews. Professor Searle's explaining the technology. Now, I'll go back. Yeah, if the sound probably should go up all the way so people can hear Professor Searle talking. But this is the future that has been denied to us. This footage is from some 40 years ago, 39, 40 years ago. It's building the Demo 1. That was the last craft built before the work was ruthlessly suppressed in 1978.
Is that in England?
Yes, that's in Berkshire Wood, on land owned by the late Alfred Fleetwood, who you can see also working on the disc.
Who suppressed it? The English government?
Yes. Yes, very suppressed. Although there was an article in Life magazine in 1968 on this work, and a weekly radio program, or actually video, TV program, weekly and monthly by the BBC on this technology.
One theme has inspired a British researcher, John Searle, to
provide an alternative to our noisy and stinky means of transportation. Since 1968, he's been designing models of what he calls a levitation disc, named Starship Ezekiel, which actually flies. I've seen photographs of it, and breaks all the rules of conventional physics.
Actually, it doesn't break any rules of conventional physics at all. It's totally congruent with all physical laws. It just seems to break the laws of physics.
Does it really make gravity waves, or is it just simply flies in the face of gravity?
It makes an artificial gravitational field within itself, 1/2 G onboard gravitation, and the Earth's gravitational field repels it with great force.
So it's not just electrostatic fighting, lifting it, it's actually gravity.
High energy electrostatics is identical to a gravitational field in Model G subquantum kinetics and Einstein's unified field theory.
Thereby performing the duty of analysis on the spot.
That's my boss, Professor Searle, talking. Professor Searle is the most important man in the world today. You can hear him talk on Coast to Coast Live tonight.
How does the Starship Ezekiel work?
It's basically 4 general sites that's used in everyday industry.
In that ring, near the rim, that's where the generator goes. That's the generator housing for the SEG, the Searle effect generator. 1946, first one was built. A magnetic prime mover.
Literally, could be called a flywheel. This massive wheel with near to the rim of the craft is 7 times the weight of the vehicle. This mass in rotation is what we call the storage unit for the energy being produced by the magnetic flux, which is extremely high on this particular car. The voltage that's stored in between these rings as a flywheel runs into millions of volts. But the magnetic field...
Actually, flight voltage is some 10 to the 12th power volts. The current never exceeds 1.5 milliamps. There's a vacuum, vehicle rides in its own vacuum.
Now, from 30,000 volts, the air just touches the skin. At 100,000 volts, the air begins to move away from the skin. At quarter to the $500,000 mark, the craft is absolutely in a vacuum. And the higher we rise the voltage, the greater the vacuum is. Now the result is that the atmosphere is tending to lift the craft into the air. The flywheel effect is tending to turn the car up onto its rim. Now, by discharging high voltage in the vacuum beneath the car shoots upwards. And the result is that you have high acceleration. But to this, you are taking in the energy from the solar system through the skin of the car, which races down towards the generator.
Both shells, the upper and lower shell of the craft, are connected to the positive side of the generator normally, and the rim, the outer edge of the generator, is connected to the rim of the craft. So you're highly negative at the rim and positive polarity at the hub.
Did that say it starts spinning?
No. Only the rollers of the generator are the only thing that spin. They orbit and rotate. Very, very fast.
Reduce your cells, and you would do the nuclear power shift. And you've got plenty of power all the time. The only difference in the behavior of this car to rockets and things we know now is that the fact that the Earth repels the vehicle.
That's very important. The Earth repels the energized vehicle at flight voltage with great force. It's broken 60-ton tethers. Nothing can hold it down. It's physically impossible. Also, it can't crash into anything. They've rushed it into try to hit buildings. It's his home. As soon as it gets near the field, just pushes it away. Anything approaching the rim is just pushed away.
If it goes straight up, you don't have a tether. How high does it go?
We're assuming it, when it gets to a certain altitude, it reaches an equilibrium with the Earth's gravitation. But you can just leave it hanging there, not orbiting, doesn't have to orbit to stay aloft.
We have no storage spaces in Great Britain. Of course, the size of fuel amount of topologies and figures we need to get to
Micrometeoroids, anything, cosmic rays.
the persistent data that we now know too much about defining these vehicles from the point of
Depending on the modulation. Depending on the modulation.
that we feel the time is right to go ahead and take people.
So these are all people that worked on this saucer. Many of them were volunteers. Some of them were paid. That worked on there were 41 flying craft built, from 10-foot diameter to 40 feet diameter. There was a 40-foot craft stored in Archangel, Russia, in the 50s. Well, if you know Archangel, that's near the Russian border. Basically, there was no Cold War acknowledged between the scientists at that time. Our governments were at war, Cold War, not the people, not the scientists. There was a landing leg section. There were 4 landing legs.
Are the Russians actually still doing anything?
Oh, sure. Yeah, the technology parallels rocket technology. It's just a lot more secret.
Is there any sense in making a real small one to see what's happening?
Wouldn't get an effect.
Wouldn't get anything?
It's below a couple of feet. You don't get an effect. Unless you overload it.
15 minutes.
So you go anywhere on the planet you want with this technology in about 30 minutes. Anywhere on Earth, 30-minute flight time. At substantially lower cost because you would need no fuel at all, no pollution. There's 64 sections at the rim called flight cells, and they modify the field and also touch the generator with a hard rubber plunger and a solenoid, which causes that 1/64th of the disk to drop, and it would just fly off in that direction if the tilt is maintained, the 7-degree tilt is maintained. So flight cell sections in between the rim and the outer generator housing, the outer SEG housing. Altitude is controlled by the speed of the SEG.
Is the SEG the generator?
Yes, the Searle effect generator.
What about the effect of air on it? Would it mess up to 7 degrees or not?
The air has no effect.
No effect.
It's in a vacuum. It sits in its own vacuum.
So it's like falling off a hill.
Yeah. Anyway, if you want to hear more about this technology, I suggest you listen tonight to Coast, where Professor Searle will be talking live, or live on tape. Brand new interview. Yes. Oops.
I have a documentary about John Searle. We were watching a little bit of it in the very beginning. This is recently released this year.
Actually, it came out last January 15th of 2009. I got it as soon as it came out.
It won an award this year at the UFO Congress, and is one of the best new films on technology. And if I can get permission, I will show it. You can, I think it's like $14.
It's like $10, $14, something like that.
Go to johnsearlestory.com and buy it. I've written them to ask them if I can get permission to show it to you, but until I get the permission, I can't share it in its entirety.
You can also go to Swallow Command. Actually, can we go on YouTube or not YouTube? If we can go to Swallow Command site.
Sure.
And I'll start reading about the flying discs or flying saucers. Because of this work, Warminster in the 1960s and 70s, 50s, 60s, 70s, became known as the UFO capital of Europe. Anyways, I asked John, this is John Thomas, asking John Searle, what causes the disc to fly? John Thomas, of course, I know, met him in person and talked to him many years, over 15 years on the phone. John Searle, temperature drop gets the whole thing going. The unit becomes a superconductor. It's this arrangement which causes the atomic pattern within the matrix to set up in such a manner that the electrons are caused to move forward. The slower they go down in the matrix itself, the more power can pass through. But the force of the separate nucleus causes that force to accelerate to the magnetic field. There's a revolving magnetic field out there. And if you call the work of Nikola Tesla what made AC power possible, the rotating magnetic field, that's what made AC power possible by Nikola Tesla. So if you've got a space vehicle, a big craft out there, then the gravity field of the Earth must produce the same type of energy as the craft, because it's acting just the same as the SEG. You are using the gravitational energy of the Earth to continue the power of the SEG. You go to www.swallowcommand. The website is let me move this out of your way. www.swallowcommand.com. In the day, it was Space Project Swallow. Let's see, not on YouTube, but just general search. I could Google.
Oops, I'm trying. I thought I was typing it up here. Somehow it disappeared.
Swallow command. That's correct.
Thank you.
Oops. Yeah. There we go. As soon as you see the blue, now let's see. There's the mention of, if you're all awake, whenever this program is airing, either midnight or 2 a.m. That's tonight, 13 April 2010. John Searle on Coast to Coast with George Nuri. And that's happening. I'm not sure. You have to check the local listings. John Searle, Bradley Lockerman. Filmmaker Bradley Lockerman and the godfather of free energy, Professor John Searle, will discuss zero-point energy science and how Searle believes his magnetic generator can save our planet from economic and environmental disaster. Now, if we could go back to the site. Back arrow.
Okay, back to Swallow.
Okay,
I think I have to type it back in. SWA.
There we are.
LOW. Oh, there we go.
It's right, 2 M's.
Thank you. Okay, have to go.
There we go. Now, let's see, go down the page a little bit and enter the site. Enter at the very bottom. No, enter at the very bottom. Yeah. Now, is it a MacBook also?
This is a MacBook Pro, I think.
MacBook Pro. Those are MacBooks. Anyway, go down a little further on the page, if you would. Or let's see, go up to the top.
Okay.
Let's see, Team. And click on
John's message.
my name. Actually, that's my picture right down there. Pick on my picture.
Right
picture.
here.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. There I am. That's me, Russell, head of Manned Flight Division, Pennsylvania, USA. And that was taken, I believe, that was at Kofi 2 3 years ago, a conference on future energy in Washington, D.C., where I met also this man, if we go back, the guy in the center, back on the previous. Yeah, that's Fernando Morris. He's the head SEG engineer. He's deciphered, cracked the code of the law of the squares. The law of the squares, if you Google that, that's at another time if you get home. The SEG neither creates or destroys energy. It only gathers it and controls it temporarily in a useful form of electrical power. But anyway, reading more about the craft, the skin of the generator. The craft is very simple to control in outer space for space travel because you're tapping in on the fields. This is John Searle talking. The gravity fields of the different planets and supplies this energy effect on the craft. The generator itself is a receiver. When you leave the Earth is your prime force and your destination is your secondary force. And eventually your secondary force becomes your prime force and the Earth becomes your secondary force. The skin of the craft is like giant aerials. The magnetic field around the rim of the craft causes the skin of the craft to act like two receiving aerials and act like a magnetic lens to focus on planets. On the model at ground level, you have a vacuum around the vehicle, so the vehicle is in its own vacuum. The Earth pushes the craft away from it. The pressure of the Earth itself. The electrical magnetic field of the Earth pushes the vehicle away from it. To stop the model from flying off the Earth, you have to apply pressure down to balance the forces. The planets become a force on you. You've got to consider your craft and everything within it as separate worlds. The Earth is much greater, so it's acting on it, but it's acting in reverse. It has a repulsing action. It pushes it away. We are a separate planet as our own identity inside the SEG-powered craft, which is called the inverse gravity vehicle. So we have a force like the Earth. Because they are two equal, they are pushed apart, because like forces repel. And then John Thomas says, when you're inside the craft, you don't feel the acceleration, do you? John Searle, no, you don't feel a thing. You're at zero on everything, so you rely on your instruments to tell you what's going on outside. There have never been any manned flights because the vehicles were unpressurized and the SEG creates a vacuum at flight voltage. Or actually above 40,000 volts up to 500,000 volts. After that, you're in a vacuum. All models were controlled by radio control devices. There's a picture taken from one craft of another craft, and if you go on YouTube, you can see the interview where they show that picture. All pictures have been destroyed while they found some of the pictures. For the first time, we could show under the craft when flying is terrifically bright on top, and it's very dark on the bottom, like a dark mirror on the bottom, but it's bright white on top at flight voltage. The biggest craft was 48 feet in diameter. With the one we want to do now is 129 meters. That will be manned. So I'm in charge of the manned craft. So eventually I'm going to be in charge of a crew of people, a crew of scientists and engineers and laborers who will be building these things somewhere in the farmlands of Chester County because of the massive electromagnetic interference. You don't want it near an airport. You don't want it near Westchester Airport. You don't want it near where a lot of cars are. You want it at least 2-mile radius away from anything. So a farm in Chester County would be perfect for Starport Earth 2. And then it says, how fast will the units fly? John Searle, it will almost squeeze up to the speed of light. In the atmosphere, you have to move slower, of course. We must travel above 30,000 feet because of the density of the air. We have quoted flight time from New York to London as 20 minutes, 5 minutes from London to Germany, 30 minutes to Australia or Japan, basically 30 minutes to anywhere in the world. So that's pretty fast. It's faster than a speeding bullet. Now I just want to read one more thing and then I'll do a quick Q&A. The P-11. Now this is the famous P-11, which was 10-foot diameter. The craft I'm building, and this is a small section of the craft that I'm building. There's the SEG on the inside and the flight cells. That's a small section of the 3-meter craft size of the P-11, famous P-11. Next to the last craft built. And there were a few P-11s. One was tested, flight tested, at Edwards Air Force Base in 1977 in California. They said, we don't understand your craft. It doesn't seem to have any inertia, so we can't utilize it because we don't understand why your craft doesn't have any inertia. Talk about military intelligence. Anyway, John Searle, the P-11 was the first of a new style of craft based and aimed at solving the problems of design for manned craft, which someday of the future will be built, which will be called Starship Ezekiel, the beginning of a real space business. As you see in the photo, this is a pleasant-looking craft in structural shape. It is 10 feet in diameter, which is what I'm building, about 3 meters. One can see the cumulus clouds, and as recorded and very carefully documented in my files, along with other photoshots of the craft taken from different angles and heights, a force of 8 wind is blowing. She holds and handles beyond all that is hoped from past work. She exceeds all our dreams. She climbs, holds at a touch, and moves not an inch against the wind. There is no sound. People around rush to hide from us as if we were some kind of aliens from another world. Yes, they are watching us behind trees and hedges, but none will come near us. They are not trusting us. We are wide open to be seen, yet everyone who drops in on us is very quickly in a hurry to get away. It looks quite comical from our viewpoint, watching their reactions. The sun is shining, but it is not pleasant. The wind is cold. We're quite happy about the P-11. We shall attempt a full launch and run at 1,500 hours Greenwich Mean Time. We prepared the power supplies to all equipment on the craft. We are very busy, yet from the corner of my eye I can see watchers, but none have dared to enter the field. We have carried the P-11 weighing 1,000 weights. It's a very, very heavy craft. It weighs about 4.5 tons. 4.5 tons. To a position clear of the overhead high voltage lines, otherwise we shall bring the power station to a sudden halt with lots of damage. In other words, the energy of the craft could cause the generator at the other end of the power station to rip itself out of the floor, despite being bolted down, and would be a huge amount of damage. something similar but different. Time is approaching 1500 hours. The call comes through from Cornwall that all is ready. The carrier beam is on for the run. Now our hearts have increased in their beat patterns, and we are sweating, not because it's hot, but because the craft might fail to obey the command signal to pull out of the climb and continue into space and be lost. 1 minute to go now. I am still sweating heavily, but my knees are shaking quite heavily with a new fear. What if the craft pulls out of the climb before it's clear above the power cables? If it touches those cables or fails to clear a safe distance, the craft's power will bring the generator at the other end, at the power station, to a dead stop, which will tear it out of the floor to which it is fixed, quite possibly tear through the roof of the building. Time to start the craft's generator up. This is originally connected to an outside source till they got the slant on the fields correct, and then it didn't need any more outside source. In our case, a small diesel engine. A minute passes and the cutoff switch of the craft breaks the contact with the outside power source. We commence to accelerate the craft's generator. Now she is on her own. I grab my camera to see if I can get a shot of this. I set the speed to 1/500th of a second. Aperture is fully open. Just saw two people walking in the direction of the launch. Another grabs his camera with black and white film. He concentrates on what these two are going to do when they realize what is happening. When the generator started, there was a whine rising to a high pitch, but that has now stopped. 1,500 hours, is it going to lift? My heart is hurting me, throbbing so severely that I can see the beats as I take a quick look down my very wet t-shirt. My veins in my legs are swelling and painful, and my hands, those veins are large and dripping in sweat. My hair is dripping down my nose. Yes, the craft is shooting up very fast, Professor Searle says. It shoots up like a rubber ball. There it is, the craft is shooting up very fast. Got a job to keep it in my viewfinder. I turn the film over. All our team with cameras are doing the same as fast as we can shoot and turn the film over. Yes, the craft will clear the power lines with no trouble. I have now stopped taking photos to record what I saw as I looked through the viewfinder. I saw the ground appear to be rocking, yet I could not sense any such rocking. The pylon behind the craft seems to be flying apart, outwards and upwards. It's optical illusion caused by the craft's power. I shot my glance over the far side where the two strangers were. What happened to them? To me, they looked like they were two poles stuck in the ground, but in fact, they were running for cover in the direction from which they had come, most likely scared stiff. Then the call came in. She's crossing Cornwall now. Time, 15:03 hours GMT. So in 3 minutes, it went from Warminster to Cornwall. That's about a little over a mile per second, just at a touch of the craft, just hardly touching the throttle. So time 15:03, so 3 minutes to Cornwall. We all relaxed except my heart, which would just not stop that mad thumping. And of course, no sonic boom, no sonic boom. Our team in Cornwall turned the craft for its run back. They had teams all over the world to turn the craft around the world. Went very fast. I'm almost done. We went over to the launch point and found that the small undergrowth had been pulled out along with soil and left a scooped-out effect where the craft had stood. There was burnt ring around, and the undergrowth meeting this point was laying backwards to the bare section. One thing is now a problem that we must try and solve, and they solved that problem. That is the pulling out of the earth on liftoff and this burnt ring mark effects. The P-11 did do many flights from the period of August 1968 until December 1968, when she was destroyed, as there was no place to house it for safety's sake. The P-11 would fill a book on its own. You might say that the P-11 is dead. She's been laid to rest in the records of the success story. Starship Ezekiel, and it was only a small bit of that story. We learned a lot from the P-11, but Demo 1, that's the large craft you saw them building outdoors with the wooden structure. Demo 1 has taught us even more, and is not yet complete. How much will Demo 1 teach us when she shot up into the blue sky? This time, a massive cameras will record her launch by slides and photos, cinefilms, and even TV cameras for the world to see. And later comment about the P-11, Mr. Searle said, of the 39 crafts flown, and there were 41 in total, probably the most interesting was the P-11. This was launched on June 30th, 1968, and crossed Cornwall in 3 minutes. So Warminster to Cornwall in 3 minutes. This craft then went on to orbit the Earth 500 times, giving us a great deal of information which has greatly influenced our present and future plans. So I highly recommend this book, Antigravity, The Dream Made Reality, The Story of John Searle, by John Thomas. Anyway, I'm about done. If you have any questions,
My name is Jan Harzan. I'm the executive director for MUFON. We are a scientific research organization that basically collects sighting reports from the public and then goes and investigates them. Our mission statement as an organization is the scientific study of UFOs for the benefit of humanity, and we have three primary goals. We investigate UFO reports, we promote research into the UFO subject, and we educate the public on our findings.